Well, hello. I'm Derek Radney, and I'm a PCA pastor in Winston-Salem, North Carolina at Trinity Church. And I'm hosting this conversation today on behalf of the Alliance for Mission and Renewal. The Alliance exists to help foster a unified, faithful, and flourishing PCA. And we're an organization dedicated to assisting and encouraging churches, ministry leaders, and all our PCA sisters and brothers in the work of communicating the gospel of Jesus Christ in our current cultural moment. We celebrate and share stories of the beautiful ways God is working in and through our denomination. My conversation today is with the Reverend David Richter, who is the co director of the Alliance. David has been a PCA member his whole life. His father is a teaching elder. He has been a pastor for 25 years, and he's been involved in the denomination on a number of levels: permanent committees, General Assembly, presbyteries. And he's been with the Alliance since its founding in 2024. So, David, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an honor to be here.
Well, today I was hoping we could talk briefly just about the statement that the AMR board put out in the week of April 15th or so. And it was sort of announcing a new chapter for the network that's been a long time in the making. And so I was just hoping you could talk to us about what's been transpiring over the past year or so that's led up to this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it would be a surprise to anyone that there has been a lot of upheaval in our culture, and that has kind of also leaked its way into the church over the past several years. I mean, we've seen that kind of like be manifested in a number of different ways in the life of our community and our communion together. And so, what several leaders from AMR have done over the past year or so is to travel around to meet with a number of different groups around the country and individuals around the country. And the main point of that is just been to listen and try to understand, what the temperature of the church is, what the concerns that have existed in the life of our community are, and just to really trying to understand. We didn't have a prepackaged kind of agenda to that. We were really trying to understand where we were and what some of those concerns are. And what surfaced from that is in these conversations was not just a concern about issues here or there. It was a kind of a broader concern about what the tone and the atmosphere and the trajectory of our common life together has been. We've been hearing concern about tightening instincts in the denomination, not simply the desire to uphold our doctrinal standards, but a tendency to narrow, or to borrow a metaphor that our founding fathers used. They saw PCA as kind of a big tent and with kind of theological markers that kind of helped us stay within that tent, that there has been kind of a tightening of that, not just with prudential judgment or pastoral discretion, but kind of long-standing breadth that we've enjoyed together. And anytime that shrinking is kind of questioning, it's kind of seen as a level of compromise. And we've been hearing concern about the tone of our discourse within that, right? Especially online, but not only online. Many leaders feel that suspicion and caricature and rhetorical escalation have become too normal in our church. Our brothers and sisters, many feel, have been too quickly sorted into camps. Motives are too quickly kind of assigned. And the ninth commandment has often been honored in theory rather than practice, as I talked about in the article. We've also been hearing concerns about process, not because process doesn't matter. I think anybody that knows me knows that I think process matters. But because there's a difference between process that's serving peace and process that's being used in ways to deepen distrust and fear. And that's really important for us to consider as a group of people that have committed themselves to serving the Lord together. But that's not all. We've also heard concerns from our minority brothers and sisters who sometimes feel like their experiences and perspectives or presence in the denomination can be treated as politically charged before it's treated as pastoral, right? We've heard concerns from our sisters and women serving within our denomination over concern about the debates that we've been having about women's roles, not just, what side you take on that debate, but also the tone of it and how it's making our sisters feel and the discouragement that it's bringing across the board in many different areas of our denomination.
Yeah, and for that one issue in particular, that was more before this year and the deacon question came up again. It was
Yeah.
more about reading scripture and distributing things like that, more like participation in worship, right?
Yeah. And we've had there's a long history of different strands of how we've kind of seen that have come into our denominational life, but that has become more heated in the past few years. And it feels like we're being, what some of those theological tent markers, right, are being shrunk within that, and it's causing reactions on both sides, and that hasn't, we believe, been healthy, and there's a lot of concern around that kind of reality. Um, I think underneath all of that is what we're seeing is a larger concern that the PCA is slowly becoming more preoccupied with internal sorting and than an external mission. More consumed with controversy than evangelism,
Mhm.
church planning and discipleship, mercy and faithfulness, and our witness to an age. And a lot of that has to do with disruptive times like we're living in right now
Right.
can feel like we just need to kind of like shrink inward and focus inward. But historically in the church, we've seen those as incredible opportunities for the gospel to go forward. And when we can't agree with ourselves and we just start fighting amongst ourselves, we're losing, I believe, a wonderful opportunity to see the gospel go forward in really powerful ways in the life of our larger community, our larger culture.
I was gonna ask you, why is this moment in the PCA so important? But I think in a lot of ways you covered that. I mean, there's a lot of folks asking questions about where we're going and just sharing concerns about some of the tone and the conversation. I mean, I had a lot of people at GA last year come up to me and just say, "What's going on in the PCA? Where are we going?" You know, and so there does seem to be a lot of conversation like that. Yeah, were you going to add to that?
I'm happy to if you want me to.
Yeah, go for it. I mean, if you want to say more about what's important about this moment, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think this moment is important because denominations are not just shaped by what they formally confess on paper, right? They're shaped by what we reward, what they normalize. If suspicion becomes normal, if our rhetoric becomes kind of harsher, like I believe it has, if our instincts become increasingly reactive, then even before formality kicks in, the spiritual climate of the denomination begins to shift. And that matters because these are not merely procedural concerns, they are formative concerns. They shape the kind of pastors who will flourish, what kind of young leaders are going to stay in our denomination, and which leaders are going to leave, what kind of instincts elders will bring to their courts and their congregations, and whether our people will come to associate confessional seriousness with things like wisdom and humility and mission, or on the other side, will it be anxiety and suspicion and kind of endless internal friction? And I think that that's why the stakes feel larger right now and more serious right now. The real question is, what kind of church are we becoming? We don't believe the church needs more torque right now. As I said in the article, we believe it needs more ballast, not more heat or reaction. It needs a deeper theological weight, a stronger relational trust, and a clear sense of what the PCA is for. And I think that this is where civility matters in kind of these conversations. Tim Keller once made the point that civility is often misunderstood as niceness or squeamishness, right? And as if it's refusing to contend for truth. But he went on to say that civility really has to do with how you contend.
Mm,
It's not a refusal to criticize, but it's a refusal to caricature and to intimidate and to merely marginalize your opponent rather than actually leaning in and
mhm.
trying to do the faithful work of what it means to be uh, a pastor and a denominational leader, or just a person who's trying to serve the Lord in faithfulness. Man, there are great temptations, to conflict in that way. Our whole culture is tempted toward conflict in this way, but quarrelsome energy in that way is not the same thing as faithfulness, I would believe,
Right.
ultimately at the end. So this moment matters not only because of what is being debated, and these are important things that are being debated, but because of the kind of church that we are becoming and how we're debating those things. And so, just to add on to that, I think that's a really important aspect of what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. So you talked about in your in the statement, the AMR statement talked about the need for this confessional missional center,
Yeah.
and about the need for a center weight. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And just say more for those who read the article and maybe are still wanting clarity on what that's about.
Yeah, I mean, in our church, I think we've kind of began to speak of ourselves in kind of two different camps, even confessional or missional. We talk about planting confessional churches or planting missional churches, right? But when we speak about this kind of confessional missional center idea, we're not talking about a political midpoint between factions. We're not talking about kind of triangulation or kind of moderation for moderation's sake. We're trying to name what we believe is the one of the really special historic centers of what our denomination was intended to be when it started. Confessional as we all know, means kind of being deeply rooted in Scripture, as summarized in our doctrinal standards. It means theological seriousness and not vagueness in the way that we approach it. That's incredibly important. Why we are who we are in many ways. And missional on this side means outward facing and evangelistic and, fruitful church planting and discipleship making and, committing to reaching people in our culture and seeing the gospel quote, go forward with power. And the reason we believe this kind of center weight is needed is because denominations do not stay healthy simply by having strong edges. They need a strong center. And we believe that the strong center that our founding fathers intended was for the church was not to fall off that horse on one side or the other. And there is some kind of this confessional missional divide. But they intended to hold these two things together as they were intended, I believe, by the gospel to be held together. You cannot have a faithful confessional side of the church that is not being pushed out by their convictions into missional fruitfulness, right? And you cannot have a faithful missional church that is not solidly grounded in the confessional and biblical seriousness that we believe that our tradition has historically held. So, in this way, these things were meant to be held together. They're not meant to be separated. And if we can't hold them together, it will not bode well for the life of our communion and who we are as a denomination. And we get caught up in these kind of debates around this. A counterweight fights against by force, and a centerweight, is meant to steady. And so what we mean by that is that we need this center weight now, and that's what we mean by ballast as well. It's not a center weight is not a voting block. It's not a rival tribe. It's a kind of a stabilizing weight rooted in the gospel. And that's strong enough to keep the church from being pulled off balance by fear or reaction or some kind of factional energy. And a true confessional missional center should be not marked by panic or coercive energy. It should be marked by a theological gravity and a confidence in the truth that we hold to, and enough spiritual steadiness to contend without contempt for one another. So again, I believe a center weight is not a faction. It's a source of theological gravity that we need to kind of reclaim. And I believe that our founding fathers, in a really beautiful and special way, began our denomination with that held us together and saw such fruit and such beauty over time.
Yeah. So the Alliance is obviously about renewal. It's in the name, the Alliance for Mission and
Yep.
Renewal. And that's part of what the statement was about, this kind of need for renewal right now. And of course, that renewal is a type of change. You want to see some sort of change. And there's questions about what does that mean? What sort of change does AMR want?
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk about that. What is the sort of change that AMR is hoping to see?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would respond by saying that AMR is not trying to change the PCA's theology or move the denomination outside of our historical confessional commitments. Our burden is not to alter the church's doctrinal center, but to strengthen them. That's really our goal. Now, of course, any renewal effort or movement, as we hope we will come, hopes to see change. We do hope for change in tone. We hope for change in culture. We hope for change in the way that we contend with one another. We hope for a greater trust and greater wisdom and greater humility, greater theological dialogue. And that part is important too. Like one of the things that I think we're losing in all of this is that we no longer have robust theological dialogue about a lot of things anymore. It just gets lost in camps, right? And we just kind of throw rocks at each other. We need to get back to a robust, beautiful theological dialogue about these important issues that we're dealing with so that we can have greater missional clarity in our denomination. But doing that is very different than saying that AMR exists to push the PCA away from its historical center. And I know that is claimed, but that really truly is not our goal. In fact, what we were trying to do is call the PCA toward what we believe is our best instincts and our best history: confessional seriousness, pastoral wisdom, institutional humility, broad hearted orthodoxy, and missional resolve. And in fact, we believe that that's incredibly important. It's vital. Um, and one of the things that I often tell people in my churches over time, when I'm talking about kind of some of these broader themes, is what's the difference between being faithful and being a jerk to one another, right? And that might sound silly, but it's not a throwaway line for where we're at right now. It's actually kind of a really searching question for where we're at as a denomination, because one of our great temptations is to confuse fidelity with harshness in kind of our dialogue around these things. And now at the same time, we also need to avoid the opposite mistake. It's wrong to say peace, peace when there is no peace, but it's also wrong to say fire, fire where there is no fire. So yes, AMR is hoping for change, but that change we are seeking is not a departure from the PCA's confessional center. It's
Yeah.
a recovery of the kind of theological ballast and spiritual maturity and missional health that we believe that is vital to help the PCA live more faithfully and fruitfully in the mission the Lord has called us to in this time and age.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that the articles that AMR published just recently, talking about the deacon issue, it kind of exemplifies what you're talking about.
Yeah.
AMR isn't pushing for one of those views. In fact, it was seeking to bring people together with different views and have a healthy conversation about that.
Yeah,
And so I think
absolutely.
there seems to be confusion. People might think that AMR represents one of those views, but really AMR includes people from sort of the whole spectrum of the PCA and is trying to have better conversations. That's just one area of renewal. It seems like AMR is aimed at.
Absolutely. I agree.
So the new AMR vision for the PCA and for AMR is going to be published very soon. Why is this needed? Why does AMR have to come out with a sort of new vision statement?
Yeah, and, the shorter call that we put out this past week that I wrote, it was intended to mark a moment and kind of like set some of the kind of the markers by which this conversation can happen. And this fuller vision statement that we're going to be putting out over the next few weeks and months is intended to name the direction of where we want to go. We felt like a fuller document or vision statement was needed because the season requires more than just concern. It requires theological articulation and institutional clarity. It's not enough to simply say that what we feel is unhealthy in our denomination right now. We also need to say positively what kind of renewal we believe the PCA needs, what kind of denominational culture we want to strengthen, and what kind of theological center we believe needs to be recovered in our denomination. In other words, the vision document is an effort not only to name anxieties, but to name hopes. It is trying to not only say what we are concerned about, but what we are for. We're trying to offer not merely critique, but a constructive theological imagination for what we're called to be in this world. And I think that matters because in moments of tension like we're in right now, it's always easier to become reactive than constructive. But renewal requires more than diagnosis. It requires a positive account of the kind of church that we are called to become. And that's what we're hoping to do with this statement.
Yeah. And it seems also that like if people want to get involved, they need to know what it is they're kind of signing up to be
Yeah.
a part of. And so just clarifying for everyone, here's what we're about. And if you want to
Yeah.
help or be a part of that, here's how you do that. We'll talk about how people can get involved at the end. Before I do that, this new vision is also coming with a kind of a restructuring of AMR. Do you want to talk about the organization itself and how that's going to be functioning and what different groups are going to be doing?
Yeah, and in view of these conversations that we've been having around the country, one of the things that we talked a lot about was, A&R was originally designed to, in the midst of a really disruptive time where things have become really negative, to try to highlight a lot of the beautiful and good things that are happening around the country right now. And that's really important because there are incredibly beautiful things that are happening in the PCA. There's faithful ministry that's happening. That's, mission that's going forward, pastors that are preaching the gospel, women who are serving in really wonderful ways, and that's important because as I talk about in the article, this idea of despair I don't believe is an option for us as Christians, but neither is denial. We need to deal with the reality of the concerns that are happening and these kind of cultural shifts that are happening and how that's affecting our life together as community. And so one of the things that we talked about in the wake of these conversations is that AMR needed to shift. We needed to kind of lean more into a renewal movement. And with that, needed to come a shift in our structure as an organization and also kind of some of the things that we were doing. And so we've redesigned our board. We're going to have a couple of different layers in our board. I'm not going to get into all the details of that. We're going to have a large movement board that's going to be made up of representatives of leaders from all across the country and from different perspectives. We're going to have a board of directors that'll handle most of our fiduciary kind of issues. And then we're going to have a steering team that'll have three main standing teams within it that is really the heartbeat of the engine of the mission that we're hoping to kind of push forward in the next months and years to come. One of those is a content team that's led by a guy named Sean Lucas that some of you may have heard of. Sean and that team are going to be working hard on, putting out thoughtful articles and engaging theologically with the different issues that we're engaged with, and also continuing to highlight beautiful things and beautiful mission that's going on around our denomination and around our culture. And the second team is a kind of a connections team that's going to be led by David Cassidy. And that team is going to be designing a kind of a way forward in relationship to kind of our need for better connectivity. There are pastors around the country that are feeling isolated. There are pastors that are feeling disconnected from, not only because of the tone of a lot of our discussions, but because of regional areas, because of the ways things are kind of laid out. So we're going to be designing a cohort program for different areas of the country for guys to come together to be able to engage with one another. We're also going to be designing national conference at some point for the same reason, and hopefully that's going to help with connecting guys together, leading to kind of training and development, but also kind of shared mission and how we can learn from each other, best practices, and how we can more faithfully live out and embody what God has called us to do in our world. And then the final piece is a denominational engagement piece. We believe that we need to engage the denomination in a healthy way, and that's going to be very public. It's going to be very out in the open. But we are going to seek to implement some of the things that we believe need to happen within our denomination, within an organized way to kind of influence kind of what's going on within our courts. And the language we use around that oftentimes is this idea of greenhouse. Like, the church in many ways is like a greenhouse, and it should be. The greenhouses are not the source of life. God is the source of life, but they're really important for creating the environment that we need in order to do the things and live out the life that God has called us to do. And so you have to tend to the greenhouse. If there are cracks in the glass or toxins in the soil, we need to be able to kind of engage with that in a healthy way that then gives us the freedom, gives us the power, gives us that kind of organizational thrust to be able to go out and to accomplish what God has called us to.
Backing up a little bit, you had mentioned the connections team. Are they gonna be doing any regional gatherings, or is it just a national gathering in cohorts?
Yeah, so the regional gatherings are the cohorts that I was talking
Gotcha.
about in
Yeah,
that way, and so that
gotcha.
absolutely is, and that's gonna be starting mainly after GA, and kind of we're already having conversations about different ones to start up, and we're excited about what that's gonna look like. And I should have said that our denominational engagement team is gonna be led by a guy named Charles Anderson, who's doing a wonderful job with that right now.
Alright, well, that kinda leads us to the last thing, which is if people are interested in this and they wanna follow what's going on, or if they even wanna start getting involved, whether it's a cohort or the denominational engagement, how would they do that?
Well, I would say that the first thing is pretty simple. Stay connected, read the statements that we're putting out, read the vision documents that are going to be coming out over the next couple of months. We would encourage you to share them and discuss them with your elders and your staff and your friends, and to help people understand what AMR is doing and how people can get connected in. And we would really encourage that. And beyond that, we want people to help build this kind of center weight culture in places where they are already are. Pastors and elders, deacons, church planners, ministry leaders, women serving faithfully in the church, lay people who are deeply committed to the kind of the long-term health of the PCA. So we would encourage that. If you're interested in, cohorts or connections or writing or getting involved more with denominational health, I've kind of outlined a little bit of, the structure that we have. So I would encourage you to reach out and try to get engaged with that. Um, and that's really important. Renewal is not built by spectators. And, I think one of the things that we're encouraging is that we know that, involvement sometimes is not sexy, right? Engagement is not sexy, but it's important. And we take vows for the health of our denomination. So we're encouraging people to get involved and get connected in these different ways so we can help and serve our community. And I would add that part of getting involved is not only organizational, it's spiritual and pastoral. One of the strongest themes in this kind of idea of how we should be civil with one another is a warning against tribalism. The tendency to see sin as something out there rather than in our own hearts. And that's really important. If this is going to be a work of renewal, it cannot simply be about gathering people who are frustrated with other people. It has to be involve repentance and faith and humility and a recovery of gospel rooted love for the church. So getting involved means more than just joining a network. It means helping embody a different way of being the PCA. Truthful being without being shrill, courageous without being quarrelsome, confessional without being sectarian, missionally alive without being doctrinally thin,
Mm.
right? So I think that that's vitally important, and that's the kind of culture that we're hoping to build.
Well, in some ways, it seems like this is some people might balk at this, but it's sort of a conservative movement. I mean, there's a
Yeah.
let's maintain the culture and the mission and the doctrine of the PCA that was there at the founding, and we
Mhm.
just need to tend to our health and try to preserve that and promote that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, David, thanks so much for taking time to talk a little bit with me and to just articulate a little bit more about what AMR is doing and how we've kind of gotten to this point. If you're watching still, thank you for listening in. And we just ask for patience as we try to unroll some of this vision. And we do want to be very upfront and clear about what AMR is all about. And we do think questions are going to be answered in due time. So stay tuned and thank you for listening.